Good evening. Y'all got quiet enough that you hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. We have plans in place that one of these days you're going to come in here and that hum will be gone. Because we're going to get rid of the ballast and go to strictly the LED. And kids growing up, they won't know what that noise is. So, I don't know. I'm a little... all kinds of things like that. I saw a thing I think it was on Facebook, and it showed these items, and it said, you have to be over 40 to identify them. I forget what they were, but they were just common things that as someone that's been around at least 40 years you would know. And I thought, that's true, and because it was just really obvious things. Someone did some thought into putting it there, and you're like, it's kind of sad too. It makes you feel old. Oh well, how is everybody tonight? Everybody surviving the rain? Looking forward to tonight. Looking forward to this series, and kind of got started last week and trying to figure out what my game plan would be. I've got the game plan, so next week we'll have some different handouts, charts, but my goal today is to begin the basis of the 400. Good evening. We were warned you were coming, Tatum. But I was trying to think what we would do. We began the 400 silent years. A lot of interest in this subject, and the only thing I can figure is because we never talk about this, but yet there are little things, and a lot of times. Even preachers will, they'll hit something and they'll sometimes go back and try to explain where this came from, because it is very different from the end of the Old Testament, say the last verses of Malachi to the first of Matthew. There's a big difference in things that are taking place. And some things have popped up that, where'd they come from? Pharisees, for example. Where did the Pharisees come from? They're not mentioned in the when we leave off. And once again, I think we sometimes don't understand 400 years is a long time. And so a lot did change. And so we see this, it explains for some things, but also there are some things that take place, basically the people in the New Testament times, they would have been aware of. And so some of these things, it's good to know for that reason. Now, we have labeled this the 400 silent years. Some have alluded that this means God was silent, but that's not really the way to look at it. God was not silent during this time. And that's really the point of the lesson tonight, is to demonstrate that even though it's silent from the standpoint there was no direct revelation given to man during these specific years, it had been given that would fulfill the things that would take place. Much like today, God is not silent today either. It's that He no longer speaks directly to people other than through His Word. And there are things that ultimately, the last event that we are waiting for is when the Lord returns. And then that will start be this judgment at the same time, and separating the sheep and goats and all that. But we still look forward to that. And so that will be coming. We're going to look a lot at the book of Daniel tonight, and differently than probably you've ever looked at it. We're not going to look at it as a book. Of course, Daniel is divided into two sections. The first section is basically just a historical section. It deals with events that took place in Daniel's life, his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and it just chronicles that. And then the way the Bible's been arranged, the last half of the book is purely prophecy. But it's not just any kind of prophecy. It's what is called, or has been labeled as, predictive prophecy. What do we mean by predictive prophecy? You want to have an idea? Okay. In predictive prophecy is events to come in the future, but it also gets specific to events that will take place. So it's not just ambiguous things such as, when you talk about the judgment, you talk about the resurrection, those things, there's not specifics as far as when that will occur. it's somewhat ambiguous. But in predictive prophecy, generally you're talking about things that will be very specific. Isaiah 53, for example, is an example of predictive prophecy where it talks about the Christ, the Messiah, the suffering that he would go through. And you can take Isaiah 53 and you can individually look at things that Jesus in his life went through. It doesn't read like something that was written 600 plus years prior to the fact. It reads like something that was written after the fact. And that is predictive prophecy. As a result, the critics will try to come harder against things like predictive prophecy than anything else. Well, why is that? It's hard to go against predictive prophecy, because if something was revealed hundreds of years before and comes true, what can you say about that? How is that possible? How is it possible that someone could determine something in such exact details so many hundred years before it happens? Okay, it comes from God. And so, at its heart, the critic doesn't want to believe in God, and so there's no way that can be the case. But yet, you look at these things and you examine them, and yet indeed they are. Isaiah 53 is part of the scrolls that was found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were, even the Dead Sea Scrolls were well before the life of Jesus, and these scrolls predate by hundreds of years. Isaiah actually wrote them, over, about 600 years prior to Christ, and yet these things fit exactly. Now, Isaiah 53 is great and wonderful, and it does. It reads like that. It's one chapter. There's another chapter in the Bible that we're going to deal with. Actually, we're going to deal with two chapters today. And to me, they read so much like history that basically the only thing the critic has ever been able to say about the book of Daniel is it cannot have been written when it was written. So that's what they say. The problem with that, though, is a thing called the Septuagint. What is the Septuagint? Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. Now, what's interesting about the Septuagint, it ties into our time or between the Testament and the Sword and Silent Years, because it deals with this Hellenistic period of time. During this time period, and Greek became such the universal language that there was a need to have the Bible translated into Greek. Anyway, it was begun. They translated it basically around 250 BC. And the problem with that is, to these critics, is the fact that Daniel was always included in the Septuagint in its form that we find today. So as a result, it predates 250 BC. And many of the events that Daniel talks about come well later than that time period. So the problem is the critic can criticize, and he'll try to, basically a lot of times what critics will do is they'll leave out information. They'll try to say, well, it couldn't have been, and basically, if you really follow their logical conclusion, it can't be, because there is no such thing as divine revelation. But then they'll leave out all the evidence that points out to the fact that, yes, indeed, it was written when it says it was written. But that's how exact it is. That's what they have to say about it. So we talked about the 4 and silent years. Now, a key to understanding the book of Daniel always begins with Nebuchadnezzar's first dream in Daniel 2, where he talks about the head of gold being the Babylonian Empire, the Medo-Persian Empire being the arms and chest of silver, not quite as great. And then he talks about the Greek Empire, with being the belly and thighs of brass, and then the Roman Empire of iron and the feet mingled of iron and clay. Okay, who is going to supervise? Okay, we'll see how that goes. If I get too rowdy, you might have to go back there. Okay, so what we want to do is we see these different things. Of course, the kingdom of God, the church, will come about during the Roman Empire. Now, tonight, where are we, by the way, when the Old Testament ends? When the Old Testament ends, say the book of Malachi. By the way, Malachi, Nehemiah, and Ezra, they are very closely in time frame. Which one of these kingdoms are we in? Huh? No, Greek hadn't happened yet. Huh? Persian. Yeah. Think about Esther. Think about the king that Cyrus Persian, Cyrus Great, and so it's during this time. So at the end of the Old Testament, Persia, and really at some point the Medo-Persian, the Median part of it was so small. Eventually, it just kind of just was called the Persian. In fact, you got to be careful. Some historical things you'll read, and they'll just call it the Persian Empire. But then they kind of look, well, actually, no, it is the Medo-Persian Empire, and especially at the beginning, the Medes had a lot bigger role. Over time, their role became less and less. But at the very beginning, the Medes had a very big part. In fact, Darius the Mede was a very significant player in the Medo-Persian Empire, the one we read in Daniel. So we have this. So basically, we're going to pick up there. How are we going to know what happens? Well, we could use a history book, I guess, although sometimes the history books they're just not really full, I guess. They're just kind of snippets. What's interesting, though, we can take those snippets and we can take the book of Daniel and we can really get a lot more depth into what is there. That's how great the Bible is. The Bible's not meant to be a history book, but yet it's always accurate in its history. So here's a background. We had the Assyrian Empire. Remember the Assyrian Empire? And basically they conquered. They were based out of basically Nineveh. And so that was them. By the way, let's see how much we've retained and what we've learned. What modern day country is Nineveh located? It's not Turkey. So they take over I'm going to let you think a little bit. They take over the northern kingdom of Israel. Yeah, but what modern day country is the city of Nineveh located? I think the name of the village, see, give you another hint. The name of the village that's close to, I think, is Mosul. I think it's the name of it. But anyway, so Assyria took over the northern kingdom. Assyria was in turn taken over by Babylonian, Chaldeans, and their capital was Babylon. What modern day country is Babylon located? All right, there you go. So Iraq. So what modern day country is Nineveh located? Nineveh's basically closest village or city to it now is Mosul. By the way, not a very safe place to go. You don't want to go there right now. Not be a good tourist place. No, that's perfect way that way. It's the same as Babylon. It's in the same country, Iraq. The amazing thing is Iraq, it's kind of sad too. Iraq is so much a cradle of civilization. There is so much archaeological things. Of course, many of those things have been destroyed, looted through all these wars. But so much of Bible history takes place when Abram, as he was known then, left Ur of the Chaldeans. What country is that? That's Iraq as well. So, all this. Garden of Eden likely was somewhere in this area as well. And so all these things, the Tigris and Euphrates River, and so all these things from there. Anyway, so the Babylonian Empire, King Nebuchadnezzar, and so they reigned. Eventually, Nebuchadnezzar, I think it was his grandson, partying it up and saw the handwriting on the wall. And so then the Medo-Persian Empire took over. And their capital was in Susa or Shushan, however you want to pronounce it. And they reigned from 539 BC to around 331 BC. Now, like I say, anyone know about what time period the Old Testament concluded? it concludes about 400 BC. So what we read of in Scripture is only the first 130 plus years of the Persian Empire. So the Persian Empire goes on for many years after that. And so that's why we have to start there. But in order to understand why the Greek Empire, which the Greek Empire basically was from 331 to 146, and basically there is a gap, by the way, because the Roman Empire was roughly, a lot of people date it to about 60 BC, 63 BC. So there is a gap in there. And so there is a small gap between what's considered the Greek Empire and the four divisions of it start to wane in power, and there's a little bit of a gap. And that is during the time when Israel, or Palestine as it was probably known then, had its independence for just a little bit of time. And then they are taken over by Rome. So anyway, these are the different things. And so this is kind of a synopsis. We're going to look at something, though. To set these things up, we're going to look at Daniel 8. And it's important we look at Daniel 8 because there's some things mentioned in this that are just historically significant. Daniel 8, 1 through 5 says, "In the third year, the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after that which appeared to me at first. I saw in the vision when I was in Susa, the capital province of Elam, and I saw in the vision, and I was at the Ulai canal. I raised my eyes and saw, behold, a ram standing on the bank of the canal. It had two horns. Both horns were high, but one horn was higher than the other. The higher one came up last. I saw the ram charging westward, northward, and southward. No beast could stand." Now, this is dealing with the Medo-Persian Empire. Now, he receives this before these events took place. And so, one horn being higher, the Medes were never as significant as the Persia side of it. And the three different kingdoms that you had Babylon, you had Egypt, and I forget the third one. But anyway, you had three of these kingdoms that it conquered and took over. But then we want to get to verse 8. It says, "Then the goat became Goat became exceedingly great, but when he was strong, the great horn was broken off." I think even before that, actually verse 5 says, "As I was considered, behold, a male goat from the west across the face of the whole earth." By the way, Greece is way west compared to where these lands are. Male goat from the west faced the whole earth without touching the ground, and the goat had conspicuous horns between his eyes. A conspicuous horn, one horn. "And he came with the ram, two horns, and I saw him come close to the ram, and he was enraged." He was mad. He was angry. And so what we're going to look at in a lot today is try to understand why this this goat was so mad. "And the ram had no power to stand against him, but he cast him down the ground and trampled him. And there was no one who could rescue the ram from his power. Then the goat became exceedingly great. But when he was strong, the great horn was broken, and instead there came up four conspicuous horns toward the four winds of heaven." So it had one really great horn. It takes away this ram, and nothing could stop it. But then when it was at its great, basically the horn fell off, came off, and four replaced it. Now, Daniel was troubled by this vision, and so in verse 15 he says, "I sought to understand it, and behold, there stood for me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of Eli, and it called Gabriel, make this man understand the vision." And so he starts to understand it. "And so he spoke to me, I fell in deep sleep, and he touched me, he said, Behold, I will make known to you what will be the latter end of the indignation. For it refers to the appointed time of the end. As for the ram that you saw with the two horns, there are the kings of Media and Persia." Now, we don't think a lot of significance of this, but bear in mind this vision took place before these events happened. Okay? And the goat is the king of Greece. That takes place way after Daniel was written, way after the times that we see. It says, and the great horn between his eyes were its first king. And horns broken, 4 others arose, 4 kingdoms arise this nation, but not with his power. The king of Greece. Now, there was not a king of Greece. There's only been one ever fully accepted king of Greece. And that is Alexander the Great. According to historians, and especially Josephus, who is a fairly reliable historian, he was a Jew in the first century, wrote a lot of different things, and he writes that Jaddua, the high priest of Jerusalem, this is during the time when, around this 330 BC time, Alexander the Great, with his great army, they are making their way swiftly, and they are angry. Every town, city they come across, because it's Persian controlled, they obliterate. They level it to the ground. As word got out, they're on the way. Jaddua and some of his other priests, they go out to meet the entourage at the city walls, and with it, Jaddua has a scroll from Daniel. And he opens it up to Daniel 8. And Alexander the Great reads Daniel 8. And he looks at it and it says, the king of Greece. He said, that's me. And of course, with the ego that someone like that would have, he really liked that. And so he spared Jerusalem. It was the only city that wasn't destroyed. Now, to some people, they'll say, oh, that probably didn't happen. But we have a historian that has been proven to be accurate in a lot of things. And the thing about it is, there would be no other explanation why he didn't destroy Jerusalem as destroying everything else. And so we see here that this was such a significant thing that Alexander the Great understood that it talked about him. And talks about the 4 kingdoms that rise after him. The rise of Greek. I think this is Thermopylae, or somehow pronounced like that, is the place of a very significant battle. The Greeks they had their own kind of version of graphic novels back in the day that tried to make all their heroes look, almost mightier than men could be, and so they made a movie about it called The 300. And anyway, it really exaggerates, makes the Greeks look like they're nothing but good, makes the Persians look like they're just evil people. And anyway, but this battle took place here. Now, it's kind of similar to the premise of what took place at the Alamo, in that a very small number held off this large group. And they didn't win, but they really caused problems. And it caused enough problems that ultimately it kept the army from doing really what they wanted to do. But really it was a geography problem that really caused the biggest problems. Romans 13:1. And why am I going through some of this? Romans 13:1 says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those that exist have been instituted by God. Why do I point this out? I want us to see that, first of all, this prophecy that we're going to be reading through, we're going to basically be using Daniel 11 to show the history of the Greek Empire. And basically, we're eventually going to get into the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, and that is the north and south, as we're going to see in Daniel 11. What's amazing about it is the details in Daniel 11, they read like history. Once again, these were written hundreds of years before the events take place. No other book that claims to be the Word of God, that claims to be inspired, has anything like this. And so we're going to see this as we go through it. And I hope it amazes you as it does me that how significant this is. How anyone could deny the things that this is something from God. But God set this up. These things didn't happen just by chance. God orchestrated this. God had said this is the way it would be. God had these things done so that the Messiah would come and at the right time. That basically all these things, God set these governments up. God had set up Nebuchadnezzar, if you remember. He used him as an instrument to render his judgment against Judah because of all this that they had done evil. And so we're going to see this. God is in control of all this, just as he is today. But anyway, Daniel 11, 1-2, it says, "And as for me, in the first year of Darius the Mede," before we go any farther, this Darius the Mede was likely a sub-king, a king of just the Babylonian region. He was not king over the entirety. Cyrus the Great was the emperor, the king that was over all everything. So, but this Darius the Mede. So, at the first year of Darius the Mede, I stood up to confirm and strengthen him. And now I will show you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings shall arise in Persia, and the 4th shall be far richer than all of them. When he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece. Now, I want to tell you, at this time, Greece wouldn't have been that much thought of. They starting to have some philosophers. By the way, before Alexander the Great, what was the government in Greece? It was these states, but they were all 100% democratic. The problem, in fact, if you read some of the founding documents, they looked into this. And when you have a true democracy, what you eventually have is you have a tyranny of the majority. Because say you have 100 people and 51 all want to do one thing and the other 49 don't want to do it. The 51 say, tough, we're going to do it. And you have no recourse in a pure democracy. It's really not what a lot of people think it is. In fact, I would argue like states like California, part of the problems that they have is because their state government functions more like almost a true democracy, and they have all these propositions. It doesn't take much to get a proposition on there, and then it's just voted on the majority of the people. Not a lot of thought, not a lot of research. You don't have experts that should be in that, deciding it. It's just rank and file people that, if their right politician says it, then a lot of them vote that way. So basically, generally you get a mess when you have a pure democracy, as Greece did. And it became disarrayed, couldn't agree on anything other than each city-state had their own things, but they could never get along with one another. Philip the Macedon, Alexander's father, does a lot of legwork to get them to come together because of their common enemy, Persia. And so that's how they were united. And then Alexander becomes a king. Really more than just a king. But anyway, Darius the Mede, I stood up and confirmed strengthened him. And I will show the truth. Behold, 3 more kings. Okay, so who are these 3 kings? You got to be careful on some of these history things because, once again, a lot of times historians don't want to give Bible credit. But where I came up with this, I feel like they should know. It actually is a website that is a group of Persian Christians. Probably didn't realize there was some of them, did you? But they're a very small minority in Iran, which that's where they're at. Very small. But this is according to Iran's historical understanding of who the kings were. And so you look at this, Cyrus the Great. Now, when we're talking about Darius the Mede, Cyrus was actually the emperor or king at this time. Cyrus, you can see his Persian name. You can see the dates, 539, 530. He even includes where in the Bible you read about him. Isaiah 45, Book of Daniel, and places, Ezra 1-3. And then you have this guy, Cambyses. By the way, it says the Bible refers to him as Ahasuerus. Now, some of these names are duplicated, so just bear in mind. He's mentioned in Ezra 4:6. And then you have Pseudo-Smyrtus. Some just list him as Smyrtus. Some list him as a different name. I think his Persian name. Apparently there was some dispute about whether he was an actual blood relative or not. And so Pseudo, it may not have been an impostor. Anyway, Ezra 4, 7 through 23. Then you have Darius the Great. Darius the Great is not Darius the Meek. Okay? Different Dariuses. They come different time frame. Darius the Great, Ezra 5 and 6. And then you have Xerxes or Ahasuerus in the Bible, Book of Esther. So that is the Xerxes. By the way, I really wish that people would do a little bit more thought when they deal with Xerxes. They almost present him as not that bad of a guy. Anyway, he wasn't a good guy. And then Artaxerxes the first is mentioned in Nehemiah and Ezra. So if we look at this from, it says here, 3 more kings. So this is after Cyrus. So you get Cambyses, Smyrtus, Darius the Great, 3 more kings. And then it says, the 4th king shall be far richer than all of them. I put Xerxes or Ahasuerus as the 4th king. He was far richer than the others. Kingdom had reached really an apex that. And so what we're going to do is we're going to kind of look at some things. One of the sources I'm using is Daniel, a commentary on Daniel, in my opinion, probably the best, most in-depth commentary on the book of Daniel. It's kind of the standard. It was written by Rex Turner Sr. He founded was Alabama Christian College at the time. It is now kind of divided into 2 entities over the years. Faulkner ties to what he founded, and also, it's mainly an online thing, but anyway, they both tie to him. But anyway, we're going to look at some things here. How large is our military? You want to know? How large is our military? Isn't it about 300? Is it not? I don't really know. They say China's is a large military. But anyway, we're going to see that Xerxes or Ahasuerus had a military of 5 million people back 486 BC. That is a large military. Let's see. Okay. What? Our military? Big military. But now that probably includes the National Guard and other things. Okay, I'm just going to read some of this. This Xerxes, or Ahasuerus, from Esther 1, reigned from India even to Ethiopia. That's how large the Persian Empire was. Over 120 provinces. In the 3rd year of his reign, he made a feast unto all the princes and servants, the power of Persia and Media, nobles. Of course, we read about that in Esther. Of course, that's where we read about Queen Vashti and the things that took place. Certain historical matters pertaining to Xerxes coming from the throne of Persia include the fact that Athens had won the Battle of Marathon. In turn, Darius, Darius the Great, was determined to make preparation to attack, completely destroy Greece. But Persian law provided that a king could not march his army until he had named a successor. Now, we've seen this and other things that we've talked about how that Persians were really valued the law, and even kings apparently couldn't change the law. They had to comply with what the law said. So the law was he wanted to go back and he wanted to annihilate Greece, but he couldn't do it until he named an heir. Thus a strong contention arose between Darius' sons on the question of priority. King Darius, before his ascension to the throne, had 3 sons by his former wife, a daughter of Gobryas. And he had 4 sons after his ascension by Atassa, the daughter of Cyrus. Artabazanes was the oldest of the first of the 3, and Xerxes was the oldest of the second 4. Xerxes urged that his father's position should pass to him, since he was the son of Atassa, the daughter of Cyrus. That would be Cyrus the Great, who won Persia their freedom. In time, Darius proclaimed Xerxes as heir to the throne. Then Darius began preparations to invade Greece. Now, our military can do things fairly quickly, but to really ramp up, even think back to the time of Pearl Harbor, it took the military a time to ramp up to actually get into the theater of war, especially, in those days. But think about in these ancient times, it would take a while because you had to have supplies, you had to have armor, you had to have weapons, you had to have the ability to sustain things. So it took a while to prepare something like that. In the meantime, Egypt revolted. So he's got another problem, another front. And Darius died the 2nd year following the revolt. Prideaux wrote, Xerxes, having ascended to the throne, employed the 1st year of his reign, carrying on preparation for the reduction of Egypt, which his father began. Now, a point to be observed until the death of Darius, Xerxes' reign was just a co-regency. So he really wasn't over everything. Now, many believe that the events that take place in Esther was after he had just finished taking care of the problem in Egypt. There's a gentleman that has written some history on this, Herodotus, and he was born sometime between 480 and 490 BC, and so he writes about the events. It says, after the conquest of Egypt, when he was on the point of taking in hand the expedition against Athens, Xerxes called a conference of leading men of the country to find out their attitudes towards war and explain to them his own wishes. When they met, he addressed them as follows. Do not suppose, gentlemen, that I am departing from precedence in the course of action I intend to undertake. We Persians have a way of living, which I have inherited from my predecessors and propose to follow. I have learned from my elders that since Cyrus deposed, who took over from the Medes, the sovereign power we now possess, we have never yet remained inactive. And now, at last, I have found a way to win for Persia, not glory only, but a country as large, as rich as our own, indeed richer than our own, and at the same time get satisfaction and revenge. They lost the battle at Marathon. That, then, is the object of this meeting, that I may disclose to you what I intend. I will bridge the Hellespont and march an army through Europe into Greece. By the way, that was no small engineering feat, that bridge he built. And punish the Athenians, for they outrage they committed upon my father and upon us. For these reasons I have now prepared to make war upon them. And when I consider the matter, I find several advantages in the venture. If we crush the Athenians and their neighbors we shall extend the empire of Persia, that the boundaries will be God's own sky. The sun will not look down in the boundaries. With your help, I shall pass through Europe from end to end and make it all one country. And Xerxes, in his limited knowledge, thought of himself as becoming king of all the earth. For if what I am told is true, there is not a city or nation in the world in which will be able to withstand us once these, Athens and Sparta, are out of the way, thus guilty and innocent alike. So they go along with it, and he prepares an army, and Let's see where it says the size of his army. Oh, yeah. Xerxes' tremendous army of, he said ours is 1.3 million. Xerxes' army was 5 million. That is massive. Now, they were not all Persians, and that may have been a little bit of a problem. They were basically a lot of the people that they had conquered along the way that they had conscripted to do it. And by the way, this is a difference in philosophy. So as they conquered these people, Persians would basically make you be a Persian. And so if they wanted you to fight in their military, they would. And of course, not all 5 million were, had swords and battled. Some of them had to cook. Some of them had to do the buildings and stuff like that. So, what a full-fledged army would do. It didn't go well. Once again, Greece employed some, and by the way, some of the history of that is also recorded in that. I won't bore you with some of those details. But anyway, the 300 did enough damage, and basically, Xerxes went in this big, huge ship and had to go back in a really cheap, small boat. Basically, the Greeks had a philosophy of just removing themselves from towns. They just didn't engage because they couldn't engage this 5 million army. And so they would remove themselves. And like I say, I've read 2 different things on this, so who knows what was true. Some say the Greeks burned it down. Some say the Persians burned these cities down. But truth of the matter, it doesn't matter either way because the Greeks held it on the Persians' account because that was why it got burned down. It's because Persian had invaded their country. So at some point, Xerxes has to leave. It's just not going well. They got nothing to show for, he thought it'd be all these riches they'd have, and the people left, took the riches, and, and so it was empty. He left a small army of about 300-something thousand, and the remnant of the army of Greece was quite a bit smaller, but they basically held their own, and so eventually even that group had to eventually retreat. And although Greece was leveled, destroyed, they weren't defeated. And Persia never conquered it in that sense. And so anyway, that's what took place. And so what we'll get into next week says, then a mighty king shall arise, who shall rule with great dominion and do as he wills. And of course, we know that this is referring to Alexander the Great. Now, we're going to see, like I say, it's going to talk about these kings. Read it if you want. It probably won't mean a lot to you. But when we start attaching names, and I'll have some printouts with some charts of who these kings are, because it will be utterly amazing. Now, Daniel 11 kind of has its climax with Antiochus Epiphanes IV, the one that slaughtered a pig in the temple and did other things. Of course, these events are also more fully developed in the book of the Maccabees, which are decent historical books, and that's what they are. They're not inspired. But we'll talk about that too, because those events are thought of in the New Testament as well, and you have Hanukkah that comes from that. Okay, any questions or comments? But I hope we've destroyed the thought that Xerxes or Ahasuerus was a good guy. He just wasn't a good guy. He apparently had an affinity for Esther, and that was to her good, but he was not a good man. But anyway, had a powerful army, but he thought that would do it, and it did not turn well for him in Athens. But these events, you can imagine. Your country is basically leveled. Most of the cities burned down. No telling how many people died in these battles. So what would that do to you? And so once again, they had these city-states that were they were very independent of one another. They were pure democracies. Couldn't hardly get anything really accomplished well. Philip the Macedon, technically not a Greek, he unites them under the premise, let's go defeat our enemy. And then his son comes up, Philip is eventually killed not a good way. People didn't die well usually back in those days. And Alexander, at the age of about 20 years old, becomes king of Greece and conquers the world. And so we'll get to that. But then what happens after? And, none of these events could have been explained. Rick, you want to have a song invitation as we, and Larry, you're going to man the audience mic for us when it does. Those that are here, ring the bell, I guess, the guys can you ring the bell? See if they will come. They're coming, so I'll wait. Okay. I hope the things we've seen once again is that God has orchestrated all things. He orchestrated the kingdoms that would arise. The book of Daniel is indeed a book of predictive prophecy, and there really can be no denying that, unless you just don't want to believe, because the evidence is there. Talks about these kingdoms that would arise in so specific details. It also talks about the coming of a kingdom that can never be destroyed, and that is the church. It talks about the coming of the Messiah, and so many others do. And Isaiah, as we talked about, 53, talks about his suffering. He died on the cross for our sake. And these things are such that you can choose not to believe. God allows you to do that. But the preponderance of evidence is there. Hebrews 11:1, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, a conviction of things not seen. And so we can be sure of these things because there is evidences. Jesus did die on the cross. And so if you're not a Christian tonight, we urge you to become one. You have a song picked out? 674. We'll sing 674. And if you're not a Christian, we urge you to come forward tonight. Or if you have something that you need to make right, you need to repent, change your ways, or if you just need prayers of the church, do so as together we stand and sing.
Decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. I have decided to follow Jesus. No turning back, no turning back. The world behind me, the cross before me. The world behind me, the cross before me. The world behind me, the cross before me. No turning back, no turning back. Will you decide now to follow Jesus? Will you decide now to follow Jesus? Will you decide now to follow Jesus? No turning back, no turning back.
Take a second if you'll lead us in our prayer. Anything we need to make mention of, that any updates on our sick list? John Sue's been updating on both Matthew and Monica. Definitely keep giving you prayers. But with us now, so we'll let Steve have a close prayer.
Lord Father, Lord, we thank you for this day that you've given us. We thank you for all of your many blessings. Father, we're thankful for this time spent. learning from your word, spending time together, worshiping you in song, trying to do the things that are pleasing to you and please you. We always, everything that we do, give you the glory and try to do the best. Father, we're mindful of those who are sick, our members who are still in need of our prayers, and we pray for our hearts and our minds. We ask you that you would be with them, comfort them, heal them. Anything that may be going through. Father, we're so thankful for your Son Jesus and the sacrifice that he made for us. Willingness to give us our wrong and fall short. Father, give us the strength and courage to try to do the right things in our personal lives. Father, be with us as we prepare to leave this place. Safe. Help us to be an example. Bring us back to the next time of Christ.